Welcome to the Connected Teamwork Podcast by Growth Leaders Network. How do we learn to truly thrive together? How do we stay connected to our authentic selves, each other, and our purpose as a team, especially when challenged? How do we unlock the deeper levels of group intelligence? Enjoy this episode of the Connected Teamwork Podcast and learn practical tools to evolve the connectedness of your team to its next level.
Welcome to the Connected Teamwork Podcast, and the topic of today's episode is feedback. And we're going to start with a brief check-in with 3 questions today. How are you feeling? What's your immediate response when someone tells you, I have some feedback for you? And what's your intention for today's podcast? So I'll start. I feel great. And I had a great weekend. My immediate response when someone tells you, I have some feedback for you is, I'd say typical response is like, become guarded. Later, I also noticed that I started developing more curiosity, like, interesting, kind of opening up for listening. So, but that's been work in progress. And my intention for today is to explore together with Hilke and Carson here, to explore together what feedback is, why it's important, and how we do this, how we take it, how we deliver it. With that, I'm in, and over to you, Hilke.
Thank you, Elena, and welcome everyone who's listening. I'm feeling present and grateful, grounded. What I feel when somebody says to me, hey, I got some feedback for you, I notice in my mind, body kind of a contraction. And also surrounded by that, a sense of kindness within myself, like, it's okay. It's okay. And then when I stay with that a little longer, it's like, ooh, this is what I signed up for, didn't I? I signed up for this, always learning, always growing more into what and who I truly am. And my intention for this podcast today on feedback is to help each of us develop a more friendly relationship with feedback so we can become more skillful in it for ourselves and for each other. With that, I'm in. I pass it to you, Carson.
Thank you, Hilke. Thank you, Elena. So first, how I'm feeling today. It's been kind of a frenetic day. Lots going on. Literally joined the call by the skin of my teeth. So I'm just excited to be here, and I'm very appreciative of my 2 very tolerant co-hosts here. But really optimistic and excited about this session. I will be completely frank that when I hear, I've got some feedback to share, there's this immediate feeling of gloom and dread. What's coming? What am I going to get hit with? Right. I think a big part of that's because I've always been a perfectionist. I've always strived to, deliver perfect outcomes. And so I take with great pride, my execution of process and how I go about doing my business. So when somebody says they have feedback, a lot of times I find that compliments are very free flowing. So it's a great job, you did this or that. But if somebody prefaces what they're about to say by, I've got some feedback to give you, there's this immediate defensiveness, kind of as Elena highlighted. But I will say that over time, what's been great, and this segues directly into my intention for today's session, over time, I've really realized the value of feedback, and frankly, even having the relationships where you feel comfortable going to that person and asking for consistent guidance and feedback, and knowing the quality of that guidance and feedback, even if it stings in the moment or it's not exactly what you wanted to hear in the moment. I have learned that being able to sit in that and being able to formulate a path forward by assimilating these new tools or these new ideas into my process has just made me better. So I'm very grateful for where feedback that I've gotten over my career that's made me better. But at the same time, I still to this day when somebody's got feedback for me, I get a little bit rigid until I hear it. So with that, I'm in as well. And Elena, I'll kick it back to you.
Welcome, Carson. Welcome, Hilke. And as I was listening to Carson, a great start, by the way, of the topic, I was thinking of the question. So how do we develop that sort of attitude, right? When you mentioned, like, over the time I learned, to be grateful, right? Even though we still have that same sort of natural response, natural reaction. So when I'm thinking about this, I remember the situation from very early days in my career when I was just an assistant to someone who was my boss, and this was my first serious job. And I've done something, or to be honest, I didn't do something that I was supposed to do. And when I was asked questions about it, I um, choose to make up a story. So it was too embarrassing to say what was the real situation. So I made up the story, basically lied. And my boss, whom I deeply respected, and it was just a few months working together, and who till today remains my close friend and mentor. So she understood what was happening, and after thinking about it, she had a very brief conversation with me, but she got very angry, I think, and it was a brief conversation. But I remember it till today because it made such an impact on me. Because she basically, the key message was, there are all these opportunities in life, like opportunities here, opportunities there, opportunities with me, and so on. And you're gonna be cutting them off if you're gonna continue this type of behavior. And in that 1 second, I moved from being this free-spirited college type of youth, in my attitude and behavior, to an adult who was responsible for their future. So even though that was an unpleasant sort of situation, it made a huge difference in my life. So I'm wondering whether you can each of you can think of a story that made a difference, and what you learned from it, and how you approach feedback based on that. So Hilke, maybe I'll invite you to comment first.
Man, oh man, we have to talk about this, huh? So we'll talk about it. Okay, we'll do it. We'll do it. So in about 2008, I was doing this work. I was part of a larger company, and I was asked, together with my colleagues, to facilitate a workshop in Paris, France, on what was called conscious business. I still remember very well. And facilitating a team together, facilitating as a team, requires a lot of trust. Like, you're going to do this segment, and then I'll do this segment, and then it's a whole facilitation process journey that you facilitate. Well, 3 days before the workshop, my boyfriend at the time broke up with me, and I was absolutely devastated. Couldn't think straight. It was just a mess. So I called my boss the day that I was supposed to take the plane from New York to Paris to say, well, yeah, I'm heartbroken. I am devastated. I'm in no position to co-lead this workshop. I'm not coming. And I thought he's going to be very understanding. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry that you're going through this hard time and this and that. Instead, it was very quiet on the other side. And he said, Hilke, I am deeply disappointed in you. I want you to think about the impact that this has on the team and the client of you making this decision. And couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear it. So I was like, well, I understand it's hard, but I can't do it. So, and he was quiet, and then he says, okay, well, we'll talk about this in a week. We did. I didn't go to Paris. We had a conversation a week later. And he basically said the same thing. But this time I was able to actually hear it. And that was a defining moment for me because I let myself get carried away with emotional drama, thinking that my feelings were facts, that I was powerless because I had a hard emotion. And actually, I learned in that moment that I could look at my emotion but not be it and still be of service in that moment. So I thank my then boss very deeply for giving me that very, very tough feedback. What about you, Carson?
Well, since we're pulling out all the old wounds here, I'll just dive right in as well. Yeah, this is a good one. It's, I think back and there's been 4 key pillars of feedback that I've gotten throughout the years that have been really poignant at different points in my career. And I look back and I'm super grateful for them, even though they were very challenging at the time. In my early career, I was promoted very, very quickly. I didn't have a lot of mentors or training or leadership. And I had to learn a lot of stuff by doing. And I was always an advocate for my people. But where I failed was, being able to really build consensus. And what one of my old leaders told me, win the crowd. You got to think very intentionally about the finesse that it takes to invest in all the relationships that matter in your career. And I was very poor at that. I was kind of raised in a career culture where you had to be the smartest person in the room. And that was just the culture at the time. And so I had to be that person, and or at least I felt that way. And I didn't do a solid job of ensuring that all voices were being heard and that I was building consensus broadly. So that was great feedback that I got. Second was control the controllables. It's so easy sometimes to look at the things that are the reasons why you think that you can't unlock your optimal performance. And I was always really good at articulating why this could be done or couldn't be done. But the bottom line is you get paid to execute. And so the feedback that I got was control the controllables. It's very much like playing cards. I can't control the hand that I'm dealt, but I can certainly control the fact that I keep showing up to get the hand that I'm dealt and that I play the hand that I'm dealt. And that's what I could control. And that was really needed at that point in my career about 10 years ago. The next one was that your network is your net worth. And this is so applicable to every area where I've ever worked. I've had a couple of scenarios in my career where I was laid off and I had no network. And I thought this great success and these big titles that I had at previous roles were just going to help me waltz in wherever I wanted. I was dead wrong. I needed to learn very quickly that it came all down to the network and to relationships. And if I look back on my career, almost every single move I've ever made in my career has been because of a relationship or my reputation or both. So your network is your net worth. And then lastly, being the hero maker versus being the hero in your quest to strive for mastery. I've been really fortunate. I had a really great manager mentor that I've worked with for most of the last several years. And one of the things that she was always able to give me the guidance that I needed to level me up. I didn't always like it. And I even told her that. I was like, I don't even like the feedback that you're giving me sometimes. I would always feel very defensive about certain things. And I would feel this compulsion to defend myself or my stance. But my goodness, every time I separated myself from the conversation and I thought about it, I could see the truth in the perspective. And I knew that there was something that I could do to get better. And that's what she wanted out of me, was to level up and get to the best version of myself. And it's been a very successful working relationship. So I'm very grateful for the feedback that I've gotten. But those are 4 examples where feedback made all the difference for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Carson. And thank you, Hilke. And we're kind of talking on, let's say, receiving end, right? When we hear the feedback, what kind of emotions we can feel, what kind of situations we went through. And emotions as such, for me, for example, are interesting, both in the conversation and in terms of how you go into conversation. And very often it may be a spontaneous conversation that happens in the situation, right? So you don't have time to prepare. So I'm curious, what's your take on, do emotions help, or should you, follow the advice, like be calm and cool, in these type of conversations, right? Wait till all emotions, because in that case that I shared earlier, There were clearly some strong emotions, but honestly, I think they helped me to get the message. They helped the person to get the message across, and they helped me to actually take it seriously. So yeah, I have like, I don't know, there may be different situations, so I'm curious what's your opinion on that. Hilke.
So for me, it's emotions are not the enemy, but they're also not my master. And so they're great advisors. They help us to, they're informing things. They're informing me, saying, like when I give feedback and I feel, let's say, angry or anxious about something, that gives me some information. Let's say I feel angry about something. That means that something is at stake for me. So me saying to this person I'm giving feedback, well, it would be really great if you didn't do that or if you did that, and I'm angry, then I'm not in integrity. So anger would mean that something is really at stake for me. Now, of course, my work is to let go of my judgment and not project all this stuff on the other person. However, I also need to let the other person know that this is important. And a way I often do that is when I give feedback, I often use a scale from 1 to 10. For example, I will say, on a scale from 1 to 10, I believe that this is how confident I will be in you performing this going forward, 1 to 10. And I'll ask the person the same thing. Or I think the way in which we have this openness with each other is on a scale from 1 to 10 there. And that opens the gap, you could say. At the same time, I let the other person and myself implicitly and often explicitly know that they're okay. And they're okay. There's a much more than this little emotion here. It's like, I might say to myself, Hilke, you're enough. And I might think about the other person, you're enough. I appreciate you. I might even say that to the other person. I really appreciate you for this and that. And I want to have a conversation about something that's very important to me. This is a good time. So that's a few thoughts about that. Carson?
Yeah, look, emotions are inevitable. I get nervous when I hear that there's feedback because I take a lot of pride in what I do. And the last thing I want at that moment is for someone to not like what I'm doing or how I'm doing it. I'll give you an example. My 6-year-old, she's nervous because she's going to her first day of first grade tomorrow. Okay. And fortunately for me, I just finished reading How Champions Think by Dr. Bob Rotella. And it was super important that I read this because the way he put it into perspective, that emotions and nerves are normal, but nerves are an indication that something matters to you and that it's very personal to you and that you care about it. So I was able to tell my 6-year-old that, and it's rare because usually my wife is much better at having these conversations than I am. But I actually got some grade A marks from my wife for how I delivered that message because empathy was not my strong suit growing up. But to be able to really sit in that and recognize, like, I'm nervous. Why am I nervous about my boss pinging me that he wants to talk or that he wants to give me feedback or whatever the case may be? It's because I want what I'm doing to be a product of excellence. But you know what? If I think about it, is the person delivering that feedback also want the same thing? Yes, they want what I deliver to be a product of excellence as well. And the intent is to deliver valuable feedback that can make me better. And that's why these people are in the position that they're in, just like we as leaders are in the position that we're in. Giving feedback isn't always easy either, especially because you don't know how the person on the other side of the table takes it or is ready to receive it very similarly. And so I know we'll tackle that at a later time, but I think that's the key element is emotions are inevitable. But think about why you're having the emotion. Often it's because you care very much about how you're doing what you're doing. And that's okay.
Thank you, Carson. We're going to have a small break. And after the break, let's talk about from a given perspective, why it's important to give feedback to another person and how. Any tips on that?
You are listening to the Connected Teamwork podcast by Growth Leaders Network. Do you want to learn more about building the next level of connectedness in your team? Please contact Growth Leaders Network on LinkedIn. And now, back to the show.
So why it's important to actually give feedback to another person if you're observing maybe a troubling behavior or a particular situation that has upset you, and how, right? And I'll share a few thoughts that come to mind. When I go into conversation, I'm asking myself a question: what's my true intent here, right? Why I'm doing this conversation? And by true intent, I mean kind of pure intent, kind of removing it from the ego driven impulses, feeling hurt or wanting to have control over something or whatever. So you kind of have to work through the layers of that before you have that pure intention. And that pure intention usually, I want us to collaborate better. I want us to understand each other better. And I want us to grow together, because to me, this feedback dialogue is really a dialogue, right? We're going to learn something about each other in this conversation, even though it's me who initiates the feedback given, for example. And in terms of how well, I love simple models like SBI, situation, behavior, impact. When you talk about what you observe, in what situation and what kind of impact it made and why it matters, right? But there are, a bunch of other things around different models of feedback also. So I'll invite Hilke to comment.
Yeah. Why give feedback? Well, to me, it relates to my values. And I think that is something that I would ask anybody. Like, how are you going to be in your values? And for my values are about truth and love and service. So when I see something around me that I see as there's an opportunity for it to improve, to enhance, or when I see something that's hurtful, or when I see something that's disrespectful, or something that's not working well, I feel to be in integrity with myself, to be speaking truth, that I have to say something. Now, I love what you said about the layers, Elena. This doesn't mean that I'm just going to be brutally honest and blurt it out, because then it's often my ego who's uncomfortable. That's like trying to control the situation. I take a moment. This is about how you give feedback, and ask myself, first of all, what judgments do I have? Because that's my brain is very good at judging. Okay, let go of these judgments. Now, if I really have the best interest at heart for myself and for the other person, what is it that needs saying? And I'm an instrument. It's not about me. I'm an instrument. What am I going to say to really come from that place, which to me is practicing truth and love together and being of service? So that's how I think about giving feedback. And I do give feedback in the moment. I also often sit with feedback for a little while. And I usually, when I'm quiet and inside, which doesn't mean that there's no anger, but I'm quiet and grounded in, you could say, presence, awareness. I'm here. And another litmus test for me is that I'm not in a space of manipulation, that I'm not thinking, I'm only going to feel okay if the other person now says, yes, that's great, and I'm going to do this differently. Because to me, it's very important in giving feedback that the other person knows that they have a choice. I am not the expert on the other person's life. However closely related I may be to them, that's their responsibility. This feedback is a gift that I give without any strings attached. Now, the last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop talking about this, is as a leader and manager, if somebody does not listen to the feedback, another thing comes to mind, which is like, now I need to hold accountable and say, on this team, let's say we need honesty. I see you being, I'm giving an example, a 3 of honesty, and this other person is content to stay at 3, then at some point I will have to call it and say, well, it looks like you like being at 3, or you choose to be at 3. Let me not add more stuff, that you just choose being at 3. This team needs to be at 10 or 9. I don't think we have a fit. and therefore I'm going to ask you to leave. So that's some of what comes to mind.
Thank you. And Carson?
Yeah, look, I think it's really important, especially from a leadership perspective, that we're setting the tone, that we're establishing a culture that's conducive to feedback sharing. It's important as leaders. I always try to make sure that the environment is conducive to giving feedback. I think it's important to ensure that feedback, giving feedback is a consistent practice as opposed to a one-time or an occasional event. We can't just show up and give feedback coming from an uninformed place. I wouldn't be qualified to give feedback to my team if I wasn't spending time with them, whether it's in the field or on calls. And I'm very fortunate because I've worked very hard to earn the right to be invited to the table when it comes to some of their activities and their meetings and when they conduct meetings, even if I'm just a fly on the wall and I'm observing so that I can give valuable feedback later. I've spent a lot of time investing in those relationships to earn the right to be there. The other element, too, is to really tie it to what matters to them. So you have to make sure that you understand what are their motivating forces. What do they want to do? Do they want to level up? Do they want to make more money? Do they want to move up in their career? All of these things, and being able to tie the feedback that you're giving into that. Because ultimately, when you're giving feedback, you're trying to influence change conceivably. You're trying to influence them and seeing a different way of doing things based on their current trajectory and what you may see as a gap in their process, or maybe something that they didn't think about, or something that helps them see around corners better based on your own personal experience. That's why we're in leadership roles. But we can't force change on them, and we can't force them to do things the way we necessarily think they should. They've earned the right to be in their role. And so it's not up to us to tell them how to do things, but it is up to us to make sure that we're giving positive, constant reinforcement. And so if I can tie a change that they could conceivably make in their process. And I always tell them often it's very small tweaks that they need to make to their process. I'm not asking you to make a drastic overhaul or even suggesting or recommending that. But if you think sometimes about maybe the finesse of how you're working with your team or working with customers, how you can incorporate some of the great feedback I've been given in my career to build consensus and to earn the right to influence. Or if you think about the fact that maybe you didn't get the bonus you were hoping for. How can we be very intentional to build a case for what will get us there next year? So tying the feedback and the prescriptive advice that I'm giving back to what they've already stated their goals are. It makes it a lot more conducive of an environment to give that feedback. So I think it's create that culture and that conducive environment for feedback sharing. Make sure that you're tying it to what they care about, and just make sure that you're being respectful. Make sure that you're being actionable. Give them things that are specific. Don't be general. All of those things are going to continue to further the cause of your team.
Thank you, Carson. And this is such a huge topic and such an important topic that we may do a few more episodes just on feedback alone. I want to conclude with a tiny story that came to mind also. I actually had to fire one person one time with the sort of final feedback. It was pretty harsh because that was like the last conversation we're having, and the person had to leave that same day. And years after, they came and asked to see me, and I was a bit, I'm not sure what's going to happen, right? So I went to the area where the customers came, and I saw him, and he had flowers and chocolate, and he came to thank me. He said that conversation changed his life. He had a very high position at the time already, so he came to basically share with me his story. So, and that just made me realize more that we do have a responsibility, not just in terms of the results of the team or in terms of the relationships on the team, but also in terms of everyone's life choices. When you are a leader and you are a manager and you build certain level of wisdom and maturity, you're also responsible for sharing that with someone when you see something that they need to hear. So I'm going to invite you to just say maybe one phrase, either a practical tip or advice or a tool that you recommend to try maybe next week to all listeners. And I guess I would start with the thought that for me, it's important when you go into any feedback conversation, be specific, as Carson pointed out, like be concrete, whether you praise a person or you want to give some corrective feedback or whatever. Be specific and bring kindness? Like how to do this with kindness, with seeing the whole person, and think about that before going into conversation. Over to you, Carson.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. I would say model the behavior that you want to see. And what I mean by that, I always try to lead the charge. I'll often share with my team, what are my goals for the year? What am I working on personally? What has been great feedback that I've been given? And where have I adjusted my approach over the years when I face similar circumstances to what I feel that they're facing? And I think giving them that visibility into my career trajectory is super helpful. Number one, because it just earns their trust. I try to be very transparent with them that I don't ever purport to be perfect. I've made just about every mistake known to man, so that hopefully they don't have to. But in all seriousness, just showing that we as humans we as their leaders are human, and also just leading the charge from an accountability perspective. I hold myself accountable, and I encourage them to hold me accountable as well. It goes both ways. What about you, Hilke?
I would think about maturing my intention. So let me be honest with myself about any self-seeking motives that I have, so I feel better. So I get this off my chest, which is usually not kind, usually not honest, and usually not helpful. Just knowing what that's like. Just not like, oh, I can see that movie. Not doing that. Setting an intention that's more mature and saying, okay, how can I be of service to this person, to the situation, to myself, to the team? What would that look like? And I sit with that. That's why I call it maturing intention, because it usually takes a little while for that to become clear what that is. And it's often not what I might want to say in the heat of the moment.
Thank you, Hilke. Thank you, Carson. And thank you, everyone who joined us for the Connected Teamwork podcast and for some live comments that we were getting. And see you next Monday.
Thank you for listening to the Connected Teamwork podcast by Growth Leaders Network. Take a moment to reflect on what you learned today that can help build your team. Also, if you like, think about one of your team members and what you appreciate about them. Let them know. Enjoy connecting more deeply to what is great about them. And see you next time at the Connected Teamwork podcast.